Should you pursue a formal professional clinical diagnosis, or is self-diagnosis the most appropriate option for you? Hey friends, I'm Mike, a late diagnosed autistic adult, and today we're going to be talking about whether seeking a formal adult autism assessment is the most appropriate choice, or whether it's better to remain self-diagnosed or identified. In this video, we're going to go through 5 reasons that you should seek a professional diagnosis. Let's dive into it. Firstly, validation from an experienced professional can provide a great deal of emotional relief and affirm your personal experiences. I was diagnosed by a clinical neuropsychologist licensed with the HPC with plenty of experience of working with adults. Whilst a formal diagnosis, something that sits on your medical history for life, is not necessary to identify as an autistic person, personally I found it really helpful. The process itself was a useful way to reflect on prior experiences, and I wanted to tease out the possibility of any co-occurring conditions like ADHD. As it happens, I am in this statistically relevant range for ADHD, but I do not have an ADHD diagnosis. For me, getting some official clarification from an expert third party was important. It's very difficult to figure out that other people do not think the same way that you do. After all, we all live inside our own heads, and it's not as though we can remove our brains and plug in a USB cable to read out the important bits. So getting a diagnosis can affirm your personal experiences, and for memories and experiences that might be bothering you, provide some explanations. That make sense? These explanations can then provide some emotional relief. I cannot begin to tell you how validating it felt to hear an expert psychologist tell me after several hours that my experience is consistent with the autistic experience. This also helps to explain how you're feeling or how you process information differently to others. Some people, perhaps those close to you, might not take your word for it that you're autistic. Having an official stamp, sadly, might be what is needed to convince them. Think about it if you're in a long-term relationship and you've been masking the whole time. It's likely tempting to think that you just might be looking for an excuse for atypical behaviour. Oh, you're not autistic, you're just lazy. In my opinion, you are more likely to receive empathy and understanding with a formal diagnosis than without one. It shouldn't be like this, and it isn't like this on this channel, but we do live in a confusing neurotypical world that can be dispassionate sometimes. Oh, this is really bothering me. Okay. Access to accommodations. An official diagnosis is key to obtaining necessary accommodations at work or school or college. For example, a post-diagnosis individualised education plan, or a 504 plan in the US, can provide a list of supports that a student needs. Extended time on tests is a really common accommodation to allow them more time to process or to think about an answer to a question. Some education settings can also offer quieter test rooms or provide assistive technology or potentially modified homework assignments, subject to the requirements of the student. At work, a flexible schedule of remote working could be beneficial where practicable, and clear written instructions and the use of noise-cancelling headphones and really clear role guidelines could be appropriate. Anyone can ask for such things in the UK by law. Any employee has the right to ask for flexible working, but an employer does not necessarily have to honour this request. An official diagnosis could make things easier. Medical advocacy. A diagnosis can guide healthcare providers to offer appropriate care when self-advocacy is not possible. I feel like as an autistic adult, I can advocate or speak up for myself, right? For the most part. But there may be times, say, if I'm maybe unconscious or incapable, that self-advocacy will not be possible. Noting autism on my medical records could be really useful here. Legal protections. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, prohibits discrimination against disabled people in the workplace and wider society. The US also has Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which upholds the rights of individuals, including autistic people, in any programme or activity that receives federal financial assistance. That includes schools. The Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when renting, buying or securing financing for housing. And the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is that right? I'm pretty sure it is. I'll edit that out if it isn't. So if it's in, it's right. That helps with accessing employment, education, training and support services for employment. In the UK, the Equality Act 2010, the Care Act 2014 and the Mental Health Act 1983 all provide for similar protections. However, the UK also has an autism spectrum-specific act called the Autism Act 2009, which requires the UK government to develop and regularly review an autism strategy to meet the needs of autistic adults in England. It should be said that there should not need to be legislation to protect and uphold the rights of autistic and otherwise disabled people. But this is the world we live in. Discrimination is common, and as we explored in a previous video on masking, if we are to be known about, autistics, or we need support to do our best in school or a workplace, we unfortunately do need the support of the law to do so sometimes. And a self-diagnosed autistic person may be just as autistic as a formally diagnosed autistic person. But only the formally diagnosed autistic person qualifies for the most of these legal protections. While the self-diagnosis may reflect an individual's understanding of their condition, it may not be sufficient when seeking legal protections or accommodations. Employers, educational institutions, and service providers may require evidence or documentation of a disability, which typically comes in the form of a professional diagnosis, to provide the necessary accommodations or adjustments. A formal diagnosis is extremely useful for distinguishing autism from other conditions. For example, when I get home, the first thing I do is wash my hands. I've been doing this since a really early age at school. It's a bit of a ritual. Now, hand washing can also present as an OCD ritual. The difference being that OCD is driven by a feeling that if I don't wash my hands 10 times, something bad will happen. Whereas I don't feel this. It's possible that in observing my own behaviour myself, I could think that I was like a little bit OCD, when in fact I'm just autistic. In fact, maybe ADHD too. Challenges with executive functioning, such as planning and organising, can be common in both ADHD and autism. Getting some clarity with the latest scientific knowledge is really helpful. Especially for women, I think, who can be diagnosed with conditions like borderline personality disorder, BPD, instead of being correctly identified as autistic. This brings a whole heap of problems like inappropriate treatment, delayed support, financial costs, and just a massive heap of confusion. Thanks to the increased awareness of how autism presents in women and AFAB individuals, as well as more nuanced tools and criteria, means a formal adult autism assessment could be a first step to correcting past misdiagnoses and letting you emotionally rebuild. I chose to refer myself for an adult autism assessment, and I was identified as autistic with ASD level 1 support needs. If you are considering whether an adult autism assessment is the right step for you, watch this other video right here. I think right here, somewhere. Oh, I'm getting it wrong. Right here. Watch this video for 5 reasons that you should not consider a formal adult autism assessment. After all, being self-diagnosed is generally accepted by the autistic community, and you are welcome no matter whether or not you are professionally or self-diagnosed. You are welcome. Today's video has been brought to you by Hydra. Hello. Also called Kitbit. Sometimes also called Miss Pissy Paws. See? Busy balls. Mwah.